Our Polly is a sad slut, nor heeds what we have taught her. I wonder any man alive will ever rear a daughter. For when she's dressed with care and cost, all tempting, fine, and gay, as men should serve a cucumber, she flings herself away. Beggar's Opera. After the death of Mr. Bertram, Mannering had set out upon a short tour, proposing to return to the neighborhood of Ellangowan before the sale of that property should take place. He went, accordingly, to Edinburgh and elsewhere, and it was in his return towards the southwestern district of Scotland, in which our scene lies, that, at a post town about 100 miles from Kippletringan, to which he had requested his friend, Mr. Mervyn, to address his letters, he received one from that gentleman which contained rather unpleasing intelligence. We have assumed already the privilege of acting as secretus to this gentleman, and therefore shall present the reader with an extract from this epistle. I beg your pardon, my dearest friend, for the pain I have given you in forcing you to open wounds so festering as those your letter referred to. I have always heard, though erroneously perhaps, that the attentions of Mr. Brown were intended for Miss Mannering. But, however that were, it could not be supposed that in your situation his boldness should escape notice and chastisement. Wise men say that we resign to civil society our natural rights of self-defense only on condition that the ordinances of law should protect us. Where the price cannot be paid, the resignation becomes void. For instance, no one supposes that I am not entitled to defend my person against a highwayman, as much as if I were a wild Indian, who owns neither law nor magistracy. The question of resistance or submission must be determined by my means and situation. But if, armed and equal in force, I submit to injustice and violence from any man, high or low, I presume it will hardly be attributed to religious or moral feeling in me, or in anyone but a Quaker. An aggression on my honor seems to me much the same. The insult, however trifling in itself, is one of much deeper consequence to all views in life than any wrong which can be inflicted by a depredator on the highway, and to redress the injured party is much less in the power of public jurisprudence, or rather it is entirely beyond its reach. If any man chooses to rob Arthur Mervyn of the contents of his purse, supposing the said Arthur has not means of defense, or the skill and courage to use them, the assizes at Lancaster or Carlisle will do him justice by tucking up the robber, yet who will say I am bound to wait for this justice, and submit to being plundered in the first instance, if I have myself the means and spirit to protect my own property? But if an affront is offered to me, submission under which is to tarnish my character forever with men of honor, and for which the 12 judges of England, with the Chancellor to boot, can afford me no redress, by what rule of law or reason am I to be deterred from protecting what ought to be, and is, so infinitely dearer to every man of honor than his whole fortune? Of the religious views of the matter I shall say nothing, until I find a reverend divine who shall condemn self-defense in the article of life and property. If its propriety in that case be generally admitted, I suppose little distinction can be drawn between defense of person and goods and protection of reputation. That the latter is liable to be assailed by persons of a different rank in life, untainted perhaps in morals, and fair in character, cannot affect my legal right of self-defense. I may be sorry that circumstances have engaged me in personal strife with such an individual, but I should feel the same sorrow for a generous enemy who fell under my sword in a national quarrel. I shall leave the question with the casuists, however, only observing that what I have written will not avail either the professed duellist or him who is the aggressor in a dispute of honor. I only presume to exculpate him who is dragged into the field by such an offense as, submitted to impatience, would forfeit forever his rank and estimation in society. I am sorry you have thoughts of settling in Scotland, and yet glad that you will still be at no immeasurable distance, and that the latitude is all in our favor. To move to Westmoreland from Devonshire might make an East Indian shudder, but to come to us from Galloway or Dumfriesshire is a step, though a short one, nearer the sun. Besides, if, as I suspect, the estate in view be connected with the old haunted castle in which you played the astrologer in your northern tour some 20 years since, I have heard you too often describe the scene with comic unction to hope you will be deterred from making the purchase. I trust, however, the hospitable gossiping laird has not run himself upon the shallows, and that his chaplain, whom you so often made us laugh at, is still in rerum natura. And here, dear Mannering, I wish I could stop, for I have incredible pain in telling the rest of my story, although I am sure I can warn you against any intentional impropriety on the part of my temporary ward, Julia Mannering. But I must still earn my college nickname of downright Dunstable. In one word, then, here is the matter. Your daughter has much of the romantic turn of your disposition, with a little of that love of admiration which all pretty women share less or more. She will besides, apparently, be your heiress, a trifling circumstance to those who view Julia with my eyes, but a prevailing bait to the specious, artful, and worthless. You know how I have jested with her about her soft melancholy, and lonely walks at morning before anyone is up, and in the moonlight when all should be gone to bed, or set down to cards, which is the same thing. The incident which follows may not be beyond the bounds of a joke, but I had rather the jest upon it came from you than me. 2 or 3 times during the last fortnight I heard, at a late hour in the night or very early in the morning, a flageolet play the little Hindu tune to which your daughter is so partial. I thought for some time that some tuneful domestic, whose taste for music was laid under constraint during the day, chose that silent hour to imitate the strains which he had caught up by the ear during his attendance in the drawing-room. But last night I sat late in my study, which is immediately under Miss Mannering's apartment, and to my surprise I not only heard the flageolet distinctly, but satisfied myself that it came from the lake under the window. Curious to know who serenaded us at that unusual hour, I stole softly to the window of my apartment. But there were other watchers than me. You may remember, Miss Mannering preferred that apartment on account of a balcony which opened from her window upon the lake. Well, sir, I heard the sash of her window thrown up, the shutters opened, and her own voice in conversation with some person who answered from below. This is not much ado about nothing. I could not be mistaken in her voice, and such tones, so soft, so insinuating, and, to say the truth, the accents from below were in passion's tenderest cadence too, but of the sense I can say nothing. I raised the sash of my own window that I might hear something more than the mere murmur of this Spanish rendezvous, but, though I used every precaution, the noise alarmed the speakers, down slid the young lady's casement, and the shutters were barred in an instant. The dash of a pair of oars in the water announced the retreat of the male person of the dialogue. Indeed, I saw his boat, which he rowed with great swiftness and dexterity, fly across the lake like a 12-oared barge. Next morning I examined some of my domestics, as if by accident, and I found the gamekeeper, when making his rounds, had twice seen that boat beneath the house, with a single person, and had heard the flageolet. I did not care to press any farther questions, for fear of implicating Julia in the opinions of those of whom they might be asked. Next morning, at breakfast, I dropped a casual hint about the serenade of the evening before, and I promise you Miss Mannering looked red and pale alternately. I immediately gave the circumstance such a turn as might lead her to suppose that my observation was merely casual. I have since caused a watchlight to be burnt in my library, and have left the shutters open, to deter the approach of our nocturnal guest, and I have stated the severity of approaching winter, and the rawness of the fogs, as an objection to solitary walks. Miss Mannering acquiesced with a passiveness which is no part of her character, and which, to tell you the plain truth, is a feature about the business which I like least of all. Julia has too much of her own dear papa's disposition to be curbed in any of her humors, were there not some little lurking consciousness that it may be as prudent to avoid debate. Now my story is told, and you will judge what you ought to do. I have not mentioned the matter to my good woman, who, a faithful secretary to her sex's foibles, would certainly remonstrate against your being made acquainted with these particulars, and might, instead, take it into her head to exercise her own eloquence on Miss Mannering, a faculty which, however powerful when directed against me, its legitimate object, might, I fear, do more harm than good in the case supposed. Perhaps even you yourself will find it most prudent to act without remonstrating, or appearing to be aware of this little anecdote. Julia is very like a certain friend of mine. She has a quick and lively imagination, and keen feelings, which are apt to exaggerate both the good and evil they find in life. She is a charming girl, however, as generous and spirited as she is lovely. I paid her the kiss you sent her with all my heart, and she wrapped my fingers for my reward with all hers.
Pray return as soon as you can.
Meantime rely upon the care of, yours faithfully, Arthur Mervyn. P.S. You will naturally wish to know if I have the least guess concerning the person of the serenader.
In truth, I have none.
There is no young gentleman of these parts, who might be in rank or fortune a match for Miss Julia, that I think at all likely to play such a character. But on the other side of the lake, nearly opposite to Mervyn Hall, is a D. Cake House, the resort of walking gentlemen of all descriptions, poets, players, painters, musicians, who come to rave, and recite, and madden about this picturesque land of ours. It is paying some penalty for its beauties, that they are the means of drawing this swarm of coxcombs together. But were Julia my daughter, it is one of those sort of fellows that I should fear on her account. She is generous and romantic, and writes 6 sheets a week to a female correspondent, and it's a sad thing to lack a subject in such a case, either for exercise of the feelings or of the pen.
Adieu, once more.
Were I to treat this matter more seriously than I have done, I should do injustice to your feelings. Were I altogether to overlook it, I should discredit my own. The consequence of this letter was, that, having first dispatched the faithless messenger with the necessary powers to Mr. Macmorland for purchasing the estate of Ellangowan, Colonel Mannering turned his horse's head in a more southerly direction, and neither stinted nor stayed until he arrived at the mansion of his friend Mr. Mervyn, upon the banks of one of the lakes of Westmoreland.